President Trump is upset that the Smithsonian and other institutions are teaching Americans about how bad slavery was. So this is going to be the third video in a video series exposing the horrors of the antebellum slaveocracy. So if you haven't watched the first two videos, please go check those out. And today I need to give a warning to many of my viewers because what we're going to be discussing are things that are difficult to even discuss on YouTube, involving consensual relationships between human beings, and in this case, unconsensual relationships between an enslaved person and Caucasians, free people in the state of Louisiana during the antebellum time period. So there's no easy way to say that. So if this is bothersome to you, I strongly encourage you to pause for a second and think about whether or not you want to watch the rest of this video. Now, what today's video is going to discuss is concerning emancipation and the requirements around emancipation in Louisiana. You have to understand that emancipation, manumission, the freeing of enslaved people during the antebellum time period was a very difficult issue for the Southern slaveocracy because they had a lot to argue with here, and watching the courts and the jurists jump through these hoops and do these mental gymnastics when it came to what they considered to be the natural condition of people of the African race, that is one of enslavement to Caucasians, and the institution of slavery itself to make it work, it gets emotionally and mentally exhausting. And one of the problems with free people of color is that they posed a danger to the institution of slavery. And many Southern slavocrats, these slave owners, understood this. You could not have too many or any at all free people of color living in close proximity to the same people that you enslaved, because they would then, their fear was it would encourage revolt or rebellion, servile insurrection, and it could undermine the entire system. That's why, except in very few places, such as New Orleans, do you see any substantial population of free people of color. And I plan on talking about that in a future video, because that in and of itself is very bizarre. But we'll get that at a later date. But the point being that most of the states saw free people of color as being a problem. And manumission or emancipation normally by law required that any person who was freed had to leave the state. If they didn't, their emancipation and manumission could be revoked and they could be returned to a state of slavery. But as slavery continued towards the end of the antebellum period, you see, as the period continued, as we get closer to the Civil War, the white supremacy sped up. It got even more hardcore, for lack of a better word, because as abolition tendencies increased in the free states in the North, the response in the South was to consolidate around white supremacy. In the slaveholding states, consolidate this white supremacy by saying and reiterating the point that slavery was the natural condition for people of the African race. So therefore, why should we abolish it? Abolishing it is doing a disservice to them, because they're better in a state of slavery. Well, now that brought manumission, emancipation, into a different light. Because if the best condition for someone of African descent was to be a slave, then how could freedom be a reward, right? Why? How would you be doing them a service? How would you be giving them a gift by releasing them from the institution that was supposed to better them? And this was discussed at length, again, as we got towards the end of the antebellum period. For example, during the Civil War, there was talk, as the Confederacy was realizing the inevitable end and that they were going to lose to the Union and the Civil War was going to end unfavorably for them, there was debate over whether or not to allow slaves to fight in the Confederate Army in exchange for their freedom. And the Richmond Examiner actually talked about this and the problem that I'm trying to express to you. So they wrote, "We have been accustomed to think in this southern country that the best friend of the Negroes were their own masters. But now the President of the Confederate States opens quite another view of the matter. According to his message, it is a rich reward for faithful service to turn a Negro wild. Slavery, then, in the eyes of Mr. Davis, keeps the Negro out of something which he has the capacity to enjoy, that being freedom. If the case be so, then slavery is originally, radically, incurably wrong and sinful, and the sum of barbarism." So what the Richmond Examiner was saying was, look, if we say that freeing Africans and people of African descent, freeing the slaves, is a reward to them, then isn't the system inherently cruel? Isn't the system inherently inhumane? So they understood this. So as you got to the end, around 1860, 1861, most of the slaveholding states completely barred emancipation or made it so incredibly difficult that it was never going to happen. And in Louisiana, today we're going to look at the case of Carmelite v. Lacaze. And this is from 1852. And in 1852 in Louisiana, one of the requirements, if you wanted to free if you were a slave owner and you wanted to free one of your enslaved persons, was they had to have been of good character. Okay? So what does that mean? Well, it's debatable. And of course, a lot of these times, these issues of manumission went to the courts to define what that meant. But this case is particularly telling about how horrible the institution of slavery actually was. So let's delve into this. And again, kind of a trigger warning, this is dealing with, unwanted sexual acts. So if that's difficult for you, I advise you to turn off the video. But now that we understand that manumission was very difficult in the South, it was very hard to do, I want to talk about the manumission and emancipation in Louisiana in this specific case. So in Carmelite v. Lacaze, Carmelite was a slave. And she was sold to a man named Lacaze on the condition that he would emancipate her after 7 years from the date of sale, right? So that was the condition of the sale. Now, when 7 years came, Lacaze claimed that he could not free her. He could not comply with the condition of emancipating her because she was guilty of such offenses as prevented her from obtaining it under the law. Now, the Supreme Court of Louisiana, the opinion doesn't mention what acts Carmelite committed, but I'm going to tell you what she committed, because if you research into the circuit and the preceding courts and all of the documents we have on this, we know exactly what she did, what she was forced to do, okay? But the court did note, without saying what she did, they did say this, that her misconduct, which was this obstacle to her emancipation, was the necessary result of the vile employment and associations to which Lacaze subjected her. Did you catch that? What we know happened is Lacaze was using his slave as a prostitute. He was selling her to other men so they could rape her. And the court noted that what is preventing her bad behavior, was forced upon her by her enslaver. So the court acknowledged that even though her prostitution, her sleeping with men for money, was forced by her owner, the court was not permitted to act upon the idea that Lacaze forced her to do it. That is not written in the law. What the law says, right, the court said the question before us is one exclusively of property. Can this person emancipate this enslaved person? And according to the law, because her conduct made her unfit for freedom, the court ruled that she had to remain a slave. So the court said, we can't even look at the fact that her owner forced her to be a prostitute. That's not the law before us. The law before us says that in order for any enslaved person to be emancipated, in order for an owner to manumit his enslaved person, they must be of good character. And here she was a prostitute, so she clearly was not of good character. It doesn't matter that he forced her to do these actions. So we see many different things here. One, we see that that owners did horrible things with their enslaved people, in this case, using her as a prostitute. And two, the courts often tap danced around, jumped through, and did the best they could to avoid making a moral judgment on the situation and adhering strictly to the law that was before them. Now, is that the job of the courts? Yes, it is. But that just shows you the horrors of the system of antebellum slavery. That in this case, this woman could not be free because she was forced to be a prostitute. And the court said, this is the law before us, and this is the system that we're going to uphold, right? So it's just another window into how horrific the system of antebellum slavery actually was, that an enslaver could sell his enslaved person into prostitution, and that the court would then judge this enslaved person by those actions, claiming that she was unfit, she had a bad moral character, and because of that, she did not meet the requirements to be emancipated in Louisiana. So, was slavery bad? Absolutely. The system of African slavery in the United States was founded and based on white supremacy. That white supremacy continued till the end. That was the whole issue with emancipation. That's why emancipation came to a halt, why all states eventually banned it. It will become the Confederacy, because you could not reward someone with freedom if the system they were in was supposed to be beneficial to them. And why was it beneficial to them? Because African people were created. They were created to be servile to a superior race, the Caucasians. This is all written by jurists of the time. These are not my words, right? I've cited Thomas R. Cobb, An Inquiry into the Laws of Negro Slavery in the United States of America. You can go watch any of my previous videos going directly to the court cases. This case will be cited in the description box. And that, the idea of freeing an enslaved person when slavery made it better for the African people of African descent, that would undermine the entire system, because as the Richmond Examiner said, if freedom is a reward, then this whole system is cruel and barbaric. So should museum exhibits on slavery look bad, right? Should they give us a horrible feeling in our gut? Should we have this visceral reaction to it? Yes, we should, because it was a horrible thing. It was a horrible institution. It was racism. It was white supremacy. And there's no way to whitewash that or get around it. And we must teach American history for what it is. This is a horrible stain on our history, and it's not something that we need to remove from museums. So again, go watch the previous videos in this series. I will continue to expose the horrors of the antebellum slaveocracy. Remember to like, subscribe, share, and I'll see you for the next lesson.